Callender takes his empty pack train with Allison to Fort Loudon to plead for assistance in finding the culprits that seized his cargo and burned it at Sidling Hill Mountain. Callender pleaded to Lieutenant Grant, the commander of the 42nd Royal Highlander Regiment of Foot, known as Black Watch, here at Fort Loudon, to send out an armed guard to recover what was left of the cargo and apprehend anyone who was involved in this attack. Callender even offered £10 for every man that they captured. Grant had misgivings about the money, but sent out a squad of 12 Highlanders under the command of Sergeant McGlasson to accompany Robert Allison, some drivers, and some horses to retrieve any trade goods that were left. In Larrabee's Gap, which is near Buchanan's birthplace state park today, McGlasson gave chase to some men in the dark of night, but with a near full moon was able to apprehend 2 prisoners. Upon crossing the mountain to the Great Cove, which is modern-day Fulton County, McGlasson questioned every patron of McConnell's Tavern, which is located in modern-day McConnellsburg, Pennsylvania, and found no criminals among them. He then reached the site of the attack at 6 in the morning to find some kegs of rum still intact and some other trade goods in good condition, but most were nothing but ashes. On his return trip, near where he captured his 2 prisoners the night before, McGlasson was waylaid twice by armed locals who wanted the prisoners released. At the end of the barrels of 50 guns, McGlasson ripped a gun from the hands of one of the frontiersmen and ordered his 12-man squad of Highlanders to descend on the mob, which they did, capturing a total of 4 more prisoners. Along the road to Fort Loudon, McGlasson's Highlanders were met by another armed group of men who were determined to release the prisoners. After McGlasson ordered his men to fix bayonets, preparing to charge, the men dispersed and let the Highlanders advance right back here to Fort Loudon. Now, meanwhile, Callender and some men entered Reese Porter's house, who was known for being in protest against Callender's pack trains and was suspected of being a black boy, and they tied up Reese Porter and rummaged through his belongings without a warrant. Callender captured Reese Porter along with 2 blocks of lead he said was from his cargo and took both back here to Fort Loudon. Callender, upon seeing the other prisoners taken by the Highlanders, paid the soldiers money for their troubles. This was an action that was looked as bribery of a high official by the locals here on the frontier. On March 9, 1765, Fort Loudon was surrounded completely by 200 armed British citizens of the frontier as their leader, James Smith, demanded in negotiation with Lieutenant Grant that the prisoners should be released. Grant asked what would happen if he tried to take the prisoners to Carlisle for trial, and Smith said they would first fire over the soldiers as a warning, but if they would not give up the prisoners, Smith and his fellow frontiersmen would fight and die to recover the prisoners' freedom. Grant, risking a civil war at this rebellious behavior, agreed to release the prisoners on bail. The 200 frontier people retired back into the forest as Grant still maintained control of the 9 guns that he captured. The same day as Fort Loudon was assaulted by armed civilians, around 40 German men with their faces painted black assaulted the storehouse at William Maxwell's house and found the gunpowder they had been looking for. 8 barrels of gunpowder were carried into the woods and set on fire, which exploded the gunpowder. These German men were from the Williamsport, Maryland area and were members of what was now a Black Boys movement rather than just an isolated ranger group attacking pack trains. The black face painted men were no longer just a disguise. Now it became a symbol. Krogan was furious. The French of New Orleans had sent trade goods up the Mississippi and into the west to trade with the Indians. Meanwhile, Krogan had his goods waylaid to the point that he had no idea when he may begin his journey downriver to the same Indians. To Krogan, he was not only losing the Indians once again to the hands of the French, he was losing money from his own pocket. On March the 12th, 1765, Krogan wrote to Bouquet and General Thomas Gage expressing his frustrations at the insolence in the people of Cumberland County, which was causing him a great uneasiness since the loss of the Crown's presence at Sidling Hill. He wrote to Gage that he had no doubt that Gage would find out the perpetrators of such a breach of the laws and have them punished agreeable to their crimes. To Bouquet, Krogan says, such a horrid crime should never be forgiven them, or there must be an end to civil and military power. General Gage was starting to regret giving Krogan this job. As the British commander sat behind his desk in New York City, Gage began to get letters asking for restitution. Brayton, Wharton, and Morgan asked for the Crown to pay for their goods that were lost. Robert Collender was also looking for money to cover his losses. Gage, upon hearing of the amount of goods being carried through the Conococheague settlement, was confused because he only gave Krogan 2,000 pounds of British funds for the public use, but yet 20,000 pounds of cargo was being transported by Collender, and upwards of 5,000 pounds of it was burnt to ash. General Gage wrote to Henry Bouquet that many pretenses will be made and stories told to conceal the truth, but it appears pretty plain that tricks of this kind were intended amongst them all, for Krogan had else no business that I can see to assemble any great number of Indians at Fort Pitt for his journey to the Illinois. This clearly shows that Gage was under the impression that it was quite possible Krogan was using his entire plan of peace with the Indians as a plan to just get rich quick, utilizing the protection of the British Crown. Gage later wrote that he doubted such a large quantity of goods could belong to any other but traders, and these traders were sneaking them to Fort Pitt under a military pass to violate Pennsylvania laws of no trade with the Indians. Gage was later convinced that Krogan's peace plan was legit, and he was relieved to find out that the Black Boys only destroyed a few thousand pounds worth of cargo. But that did not stop Gage from scolding Krogan in a letter dated on April the 4th, 1765, in which he says, if you had only minded the business you were employed in, followed your instructions, and made use of the permit given you by Colonel Bouquet for carrying up the goods to Fort Pitt, without taking upon you to encourage traders to act contrary to the law of the province, you would not have been involved in any difficulties on this account. The government of Pennsylvania, know when it is proper, will issue proclamations to that effect, and when that happens, there will be no danger of any want of goods at Fort Pitt. Governor John Penn sat in Philadelphia, faced with yet another problem since he became governor in 1763. First it was Pontiac's War, then it was the Paxton Boys incident that resulted in his city of Philadelphia being threatened by armed men from the frontier. Now it's the Black Boys and the people of Cumberland County. Everyone was writing him letters, and he decided that he had to go to the frontier to sort all this mess out. In late March of 1765, Governor Penn arrived at the Cumberland County seat of Carlisle, and everything was in pandemonium. Traders wanted retribution, the local government was confused on what side to support, and local frontier people wanted protection. Once at Carlisle, the frontier people of Cumberland County, which contained the Pennsylvania part of the Conococheague settlement, gave Governor Penn a petition that expressed their sorrowful view. The petition said, "Permit us, honorable sir, to express to you on this occasion the alarming apprehensions which we have of being again involved in another war, from the unseizable supplies of clothing and warlike stores which we understand are preparing in great abundance, and amongst them a large quantity of ammunition, powder, lead, and scalping knives being already in our country, and destined for the savage, faithless and unrelenting enemy, cannot but raise in our breasts the horrible images of murdered families, captivated brethren and friends, men, women, and children exposed to all the cruelties and miseries which their savage dispositions can prompt them to inflict. Our houses and farms involved in flames. But alas, what does it avail us that the French are removed out of our country, that they can no longer excite and assist the Indians, to ravage our settlements and murder our friends, if our own fellow subjects, regardless of His Majesty's or His officers' proclamations, nay, of all the laws of God and man, are still continuing to supply them with the means of our destruction? Have we, with the broken remains of our dismembered families, escaped the unheard of cruelties of 2 Indian wars only to be involved in a third? But those very persons who have hitherto sufficiently testified the want of humanity and compassion for our distresses, do they so eagerly thirst for our blood that nothing will satisfy them but the utter destruction of our whole families? Or are they so bent upon enriching themselves by an Indian trade that they will do it at the expense of so much blood and treasure as it must cost the crown in the colonies? Permit us, honorable sir, to implore your protection against the attempts of our fellow subjects, who, being remote from danger, sit at ease and know not what we feel, and to beseech you to interpose your authority to stop those goods from going to the enemy until peace be finally concluded, and to find out and bring to punishment the persons concerned in this unlawful commerce with our enemies, which has already influenced a number of people who have suffered greatly from the incursions of the savages to assemble in a tumultuous and lawless manner to destroy some of the goods. The frontier people understood that the actions of the black boys were unlawful, but they say quite clearly that their hands were tied. It was either act in a lawless manner or risk arming the enemy that killed so many of their family members beforehand in previous wars. So they implored Governor Penn to arrest the traitors that broke the Pennsylvania law. Instead, Governor Penn, per the wants of the traders, the merchants, and the British military, pursued the black boys and the people of the Conococheague settlement. So right now I'm in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and behind me is the Cumberland County Jail. Now, this was built in the 1850s. It looks like a castle. It's actually a reconstruction or a mimic of a castle in England, Carlisle, England. But they built it in the 1850s. But originally, they said here in 1754 they built the original Carlisle Jail, which was some sort of stone structure, and that Carlisle Jail would have sat here at the corner of Bedford Street and High Street here in Carlisle, and that was where these prisoners that were originally taken at Fort Loudon by the Highlanders, they were thinking about bringing them up here, but they never did. For over a week, Governor John Penn and his advisors worked in Carlisle to take sworn depositions and meet with justices and traders. Governor Penn understood that the people involved were upset about the British military overstepping their mandate by arresting men without considering civil law and the civil rights of the men taken prisoner. So, Penn decided to do it by the book and commission a grand jury, per the law. Now, Penn issued warrants for arrests of men, Colander, and other traders identified as black boys who were most likely present at the attack on the pack trains. The sheriff of Cumberland County was sent to the Conococheague settlement in the Great Cove to arrest these men and bring them here to Carlisle Jail, that said right here at this very spot. But the sheriff was unsuccessful as the men he was after disappeared and hid from his authority, clearly tipped off by someone involved at the court prep here in Carlisle. Now, Penn gathered testimony of witnesses and built a case to present to this grand jury created from people from Cumberland County, per the English civil law. This was a jury of their own peers. Penn left Carlisle before the grand jury convened at the beginning of April, but he was paramount in building the case against the men identified as members of the Black Boys. Now, Justice William Smith was brought in as a witness, and he was scrutinized heavily for aiding the Black Boys. Justice Smith claimed no involvement and no knowledge of the identity of the perpetrators, which was, of course, highly unlikely. But he did put up a great defense of the frontier people, again bringing up concerns mentioned in their petition to Penn. He defended the actions of the people as the only way to enforce the laws of Pennsylvania, and protect the frontier at that time. He also argued that civil law, being the local law governing the civil rights of British subjects, was ignored by the British soldiers at Fort Loudon when they apprehended British subjects without proper warrants from a judge, captured private property without warrants, and held people prisoner in a military installation instead at a county jail and without a trial. He further argued that the military should have no jurisdiction where civil law supersedes. The jury, made of local men from Cumberland County that also suffered through the Indian Wars and obviously did not want to see their families attacked again, came back with their verdict. No sufficient testimony to convict a single person. The accused were acquitted. Penn's comment on the verdict was that every man in Cumberland County was a rioter at heart, and 10,000s of the king's troops could not bring one to trial. He also wrote General Gage that in a regular course of justice, I have done everything on this occasion that could be done consistent with the law. Penn also said that this acquittal would make the black boys more bold and audacious, because now they would view their actions as legal and warrantable. After the attack on the pack trains and the rescue of the captured men at Fort Loudon in the beginning part of March of 1765, the local inhabitants of the Clonakajig settlement began to take up the mantle of the black boys as they set up a guard along the roads in their settlement and ordered inspections of all goods going west that they suspected of being Indian trade goods. The idea was, if the government wasn't going to enforce the Pennsylvania no trade policy, then the locals would take up the job. For several months, volunteers joined the Black Boys movement and stood guard on the roads to inspect the goods moving west. They would issue passes to these traders that passed their inspections so they would not be waylaid again by any other patrols. An example of one of these passes is one given to Mr. John Gibson on June 1st of 1765, which lists the items that he carried with a statement that said, "We, they subscribers, being chosen by John Gibson with the consent and approbation of William Smith, John Ranwells, and John Allison, Esquires, to inspect a quantity of liquors, dry goods, etc., which goods, etc., the said Gibson is about to carry to Fort Pitt. In prudence whereof we have examined all the loads including in the above invoice and have found no warlike stores, or any article that in our opinion can be any disadvantage or enable the Indians to point their arms against the frontier inhabitants. Given under our hands this first day of June, 1765, signed Robert Smith and Francis Patterson." A pass dated May 15th, 1765 by James Smith said, "As the Sidling Hill volunteers have already inspected these goods, and as they are all private property, it is expected that none of these brave fellows will molest them upon the road, as there is no Indian supplies amongst them." Note that James Smith called the Black Boys the Sidling Hill Volunteers and the Brave Fellows. They not only targeted traders, but also military members as well along the road. A pass from May 20th, 1765, signed by Justice William Smith said, "Permit the bearers, Alex McKinley and Lakeland McGillen, to pass unmolested to and from Antietam, they behaving themselves soberly and inoffensively as becomes loyal subjects, they being soldiers, carrying a letter to Daniel McKay, and as they say, is going to purchase 2 cows. This Black Boys movement spread along the frontier like wildfire, even moving outside the Clonakajig settlement into Cumberland County to other frontier counties. Near Lancaster, a group called the Paxtonians, reminiscent of the Paxton Boys, stopped wagons at Harris's Ferry, modern-day Harrisburg, Pennsylvania area today, and inspected their goods that was going to the trading post at Shamokin. Justice William Smith became the legal authority of the Black Boys movement. His particular view of the law believed that the Crown and the British Empire gave the power to regulate the trade within a colony to its governor. Because the official representatives of the governor on the Pennsylvania frontier was the Justice of the Peace, the power to inspect trade goods rested on the authority of the local justices. Justice William Smith sided with the frontier people and allowed for the inspections to occur. Other justices agreed with this interpretation of the law and also supported the inspections. At a time when the British military and the British imperial government was trying to centralize power here in the colonies, the people in the frontier were arguing for it to be decentralized and left up to the local magistrates and colonial governments, agreeing that the civil law governing the civil rights of British subjects should prevail over the military and imperial rules. This patrolling and inspecting was working well until a pack train shipment of about 40 to 60 horses refused to be inspected, which resulted into more violence on the frontier.